afternoon, Minister.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening. I'm Hatim Kheir, counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. So the first document I'd like to take you to is the one that we've been talking about for a bit now. It's SSM NSC CAN 50625 REL 3001. And so while that's being pulled up, this is the document relating to the First Minister's conference call, as it says right there. And if we could please go to page 2. Yes, there where, do you see under Premier Horgan's third point, he said that local law enforcement was able to manage. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, and if we could please go to page 3. If we can go to Premier Kenney's comments. So at the top of his first point, do you see there where he said that 15 days ago they had 1,000 trucks doing a rolling protest, but then 900 went home. It was reduced to 100 hardcore who stayed behind. And then just a little bit beyond that, he says they're down to a group of 40 for the past several days. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then do you also see where between the redactions, Premier Horgan informed the ministers at the meeting that they have procured on-market for equipment and have drivers in place, so unless an unexpected surprise should open Cootes border crossing today. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
Okay, and then lastly, under the, lastly with respect to Premier Kenney, under the redactions, if we can just scroll down a little bit, it seems that Premier Kenney informed the First Minister's meeting that at a previous meeting he had asked the federal government to stop the vaccine mandate for truckers. He said he doesn't understand the public health rationale given the level of transmission. Truckers are isolated in cabs, do rapid tests, and that, quote, he said he, quote, thought it was an unnecessary provocation, end quote. Premier Kenney informed the First Minister's meeting of that?
Yes, as I said, this is, in my view, an accurate summary of that meeting.
Okay, and then just proceeding on to page 5, Premier Stephenson for Manitoba, under her second point, informed the government that the RCMP were confident that they had the tools in place under provincial law needed at the Emerson border crossing, and they were finalizing plans to open the border, correct?
Yep, that's what it says.
Okay, so all those premiers had informed the federal government that further powers were not needed then in their provinces.
That was their view during that meeting, yes.
Okay, thank you. The next, I'm going to change course a little bit here. If we can please pull up SSM CAN 6094 REL 301. And while that's coming up, we've already heard about how you had a discussion with Premier Ford on February 10th, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if we can please just scroll down to the second email in the chain, which I take it was chronologically the first email. This is a readout of that conversation that you had with Premier Ford?
Yes, that's a summary that my Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Michael Vandergriff, would have circulated to colleagues across the government that you see noted at the top of that email. Okay, and Mr. Clerk, can we please scroll down to the second page? I want to take you to the final paragraph in the summary. So it says there that the Premier had informed you that on the following Monday, which I take it would be February 14th, he will be announcing plans to relax public health measures. And he said in his view, quote, the public is at a breaking point, end quote, and then he refers to other jurisdictions taking these steps. Do you see that? Yes.
And I take it that accords with your recollection of the call?
Yes.
Okay, now he refers to other jurisdictions taking steps. Was it your understanding that he was referring to Alberta, who had announced that they were implementing an accelerated removal of COVID restrictions on February 8th?
To be honest, I don't want to mislead you. I would not be able to say which jurisdiction he was referring to. He may have been talking, obviously, to other provincial premiers, and his officials would have been. They speak actively amongst themselves, as would Dr. Moore, who was his chief public health officer, with their counterparts. So I can't purport to remember the sequence of which jurisdiction was enacting or altering which particular measures.
Okay, so given that they're all talking amongst themselves, he might have actually even been referring to Manitoba, which made a similar announcement the following day, or Saskatchewan, which made an announcement on the same day for Premier Ford had made that plan, right?
Again, I'm taking your word for it. I don't remember the sequence of which province changed what public health posture within their own jurisdiction, but I take your word for it if you have a sequence of provincial public health measures.
Okay, I want to hone in on one point that Premier Ford raised there. He referred to the public being at its breaking point. Would you agree that the Freedom Convoy protest was one expression of that sentiment?
I would think that certainly in the initial days of the convoy, that attracted a great deal of that sentiment. And our government has acknowledged the difficulty that COVID represented for millions of Canadians. We, the Prime Minister, ministers have acknowledged that this has been extremely difficult on many Canadians, on sectors of the economy. We all know the list of very difficult circumstances that the pandemic brought. So we acknowledge that. And certainly as the convoy was taking form and the first day that we saw on Parliament Hill, there were probably a number of lawful protesters that came to express that sentiment. That wasn't the case as the thing dragged on and as it evolved. But in the initial steps, I think that might be a fair characterization that some of the people participating in some of the convoy activities fit in that category. Clearly, some didn't.
But you'd agree as a general principle that generally the goal of protesters is to be heard by their government on an issue that concerns them?
I'm not sure I'd generalize that across protest movements around the world or across the country. I can't speak to why particular protest movements are formed. One protests because one wants to bring public attention to a particular issue or bring a certain public policy or governmental policy to public attention. But I wouldn't purport to speak for why people show up at protests or organize protests.
Well, you'd agree that that ability to protest is one of the reasons it's protected in our charter is because it's important to that democratic process. It's the voice of, it's one of the ways that people can have a voice.
Absolutely. Lawful and peaceful protest is an essential part of any democracy. And as you said, it's protected constitutionally in Canada.
So you'd agree that the provinces then that were responding to these protests by lifting their restrictions would be an example of protesters being successfully heard, right?
No, I wouldn't speak for why provincial health authorities made those decisions. I have noted on a number of occasions that Premier Ford, in the case of Ontario, referred to following the medical advice from Dr. Moore, his chief public health officer, and other scientists. So no, I wouldn't purport to say, and I certainly don't purport to speak for premiers or their health ministers or their chief public health officers. They can explain why they made particular decisions with respect to their public health measures. But to say that it is in response to a protest, I think is a pretty simplistic analysis that may not be borne out by what a number of them have said publicly.
What they've said publicly, but if we look at Premier Ford's comments in this call, I grant you, he says he has the support of Dr. Moore, but he says that the public is at a breaking point, and so he's going to put in a more aggressive schedule in Ontario. You didn't take him to be referring to taking action in response to the protest?
No, because in that same conversation, he talked about his extreme frustration with the protests and the illegal blockades and the serious multi-billion-dollar damage it was doing to the economy of Ontario. He shared with me the conversations he had with the governor of Michigan He shared with me the conversations with union leaders, business leaders about the investment climate that this was sending for Ontario. He spoke to me about the very real risk of violence in Ottawa, the illegal occupation of Ottawa. He was not crediting the illegal occupation or blockades with his decision to adjust public health measures. And in fact, he referred to his chief public health officer in that context as well.
He wasn't crediting that decision, but it doesn't mean it wasn't motivating it, right?
Well, Premier Ford is quite an articulate political leader. I can't speak for why he made particular decisions within the sovereign jurisdiction of the government of Ontario. But my frequent conversations with him would lead me to believe that the decisions that he made on the appropriate public health measures, and Ontario was one of the jurisdictions in the country that had at various times amongst the most severe measures. So his government had taken very difficult and very real steps in the fight against the coronavirus, which we thought were very conducive to trying to protect as many citizens of his province as possible. So his leadership with respect to public health measures, from my conversations with him, was not motivated by the illegal blockade that was causing such harm to the economy of Ontario in Windsor, or the completely unacceptable illegal occupation of the city of Ottawa.
Well, let's turn our attention to a different premier. I'm going to ask that we pull up PB Can 401846. You've already seen this, I believe, that, or at least a different version of this document. And Mr. Clerk, if we can please go to the last page, we're going to have to zoom in on the second screenshot. Perhaps if we can even just zoom in a little bit more. It's okay if the bottom gets cut off. Okay. So apologies for the quality of the screenshot. This is how we received it. But do you see there at the top it says the date, Friday, February 11th?
I do.
Okay. And then it says there, Dominic. I take it that this was I think actually it was already in response to Commission Council. This is a message that you sent.
Yeah, this is I had sort of copy pasted a text message that I had received. I'm guessing if it was 7:47 in the morning, I might have received it overnight from Premier Kenney, and I was forwarding it, I think, to my colleagues.
Okay, so the message from Premier Kenney that you were forwarding, which has already been referred to, is that he said the trucker vax policy is obviously just dumb political theater. Calling them Nazis hasn't exactly helped, right?
Those were his words and his message to me.
Right. Now, my question for you, Minister, is was this sentiment ever relayed to Cabinet as a whole?
I was updating my Cabinet colleagues at the Incident Response Group on various discussions with premiers. I would have forwarded that to, I think, I can't see the top of it, but I remember it was Minister Alghabra, I think Omar, and probably Marco Mendicino. But I was updating my Cabinet colleagues on those interactions. But so too was Dr. Tam, who was talking to her Chief Public Health Officer counterparts. So the sharing of information around the views of provincial governments was much broader than my summarizing for Cabinet colleagues various conversations that I may have had with premiers.
Given, and you know, we did see that Premier Kenney raised a similar statement, though perhaps with different language, at the First Minister's meeting. Did the government consider lifting restrictions as a way to hear what the protesters were asking for?
No, the decisions that we made on public health measures were informed by public health advice from doctors and from scientists. That was always the focal point of our decision making as a government with respect to these public health measures.
I put it to you that Premier Kenney was right and that the removal of the exemption for truckers that led to this whole protest in the first place was just a political tactic.
Well, it won't surprise you that I don't share that view. And I would also remind you that the United States had a vaccine mandate with respect to truckers that the government of Canada was not able to lift. So there was also a lot of confusion around whether, if ultimately based on medical and scientific advice, we determined that that particular mandate was no longer necessary. If the United States government hadn't lifted that particular measure, it wouldn't have changed much for truckers trying to cross that particular international border, as an example.
Well, what about referring to the protesters as Nazis? I put it to you that that was also a political tactic.
Again, I don't share that view. I didn't agree with the characterization of Premier Kenney. I shared his message with colleagues of mine.
Okay, those are all the questions I have. Thank you. And I believe there's some time left over so I can pay back yesterday's indulgence with interest.
Okay, thank you.